When a product stays in production for a very long time, people compliment it for its longevity and success, but that doesn't really seem to apply to the Boeing 737. Instead, quite a few critics are now arguing that its design is a relic of a bygone era and really shouldn't have a place in the modern world anymore. And here's the thing. You probably know the story behind Boeing's merger with McDonnell Douglas and the slow decline that then followed. But if you think that this merger is what defined the legacy of the 737, well, then you would be wrong. In fact, the fate of the 737 was effectively sealed nearly 2 decades before that. You see, something happened to this design in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a quick fix during its development that would end up defining its evolution to this day. And that was actually a shame, because the story of this plane could easily have been very different. Now today I'm going to show you what I mean by that, and while we're at it, I'll also give you a sneak peek into some fun that I had in a simulator which is not the 737, but definitely related. Now to be clear, this video isn't meant to be a complete history of the Boeing 737. We would need a couple of hours to dive into that, but what you do need to know today is that the first ever 737, the 737-100, flew its maiden flight back in 1967 and then entered service in February of 1968. The slightly longer and much more popular Boeing 737-200 then entered service a couple of months after that, and these models are now referred to as the 737 Originals or Jurassics, to distinguish them from the next 3 generations that followed. The 737 Classic, the 737 Next Generation or NG, and finally the 737 MAX family. Now the 737-200 quickly became the backbone of many airlines around the world in the 1960s and 70s, and it was used for nearly every role except the long-haul routes. Boeing were by then also making the bigger 727, which predated the 737 by a few years. But the 73, with its 2 engines and 2 flight crew in the cockpit versus 3 people in the 727, would end up much more popular. But then, around the mid-1970s, something interesting happened. The CFM56, which was a brand new, super modern high-bypass turbofan engine, became available. Now CFM was a joint venture between General Electric in the United States and Snecma in France, which was later renamed Safran. And originally, these 2 companies had formed CFM to make an engine that could be used to re-engine existing 4-engine jets, like the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8. But that's not what this engine became famous for. Now the story of the CFM56 deserves its own video, but the point here is that Boeing immediately saw that this engine would become an ideal option for the smaller 2-engine jets like the 737, and they just couldn't afford to ignore it. But the mid-1970s were also a quite busy time for Boeing, who was still recovering from a near meltdown less than a decade earlier, plus they were working on putting together a couple of other aircraft designs, which would eventually become the 757 and the 767. This meant that it took them a few more years to decide what to do with the CFM56, but eventually, in the beginning of the 80s, Boeing started putting together the specifications for what we today know as the 737 Classic family. Now, as many of you already know, fitting the CFM56 under the wings of the 737 wasn't easy. The 737 fuselage and wing sat low down to the ground, and since the new engines had a much larger diameter, they had to now be fitted much further forward, effectively in front of the wing. The engine itself also had to be reconfigured slightly, so that accessories like the gearbox were moved to the sides and away from the bottom. And this was to add some precious ground clearance, and the effect of that was that the bottom side of the engine got that trademark flat chipmunk appearance. There were also a few other changes made to the plane. The wingspan grew a bit and the fuselage got a bit longer, allowing for a few more passenger seats, and since the new engines were more powerful, the vertical tail fin also grew a bit to help counter that extra engine power and yaw that it could create after an engine failure. But more importantly, the instrument panel in the cockpit was completely revamped, along with improvements in several aircraft systems. And that meant that the 737 Classic family could now not use the same pilot type rating as the original 737s had. So what did that mean then? Well, commercial aircraft aren't like cars or trucks that you can just drive by simply getting a driver's license. No, we also need to get a formal certification that allows us pilots to operate a specific aircraft type, which is what a type rating is. The systems, the handling characteristics, emergency procedures, and really the whole philosophy of flying, for example an Airbus A320, is very different from flying a Boeing 737, so these planes obviously need different type ratings. But usually, a single type rating will still allow pilots to fly different variants within a single aircraft family. So for example, the Boeing 737-100 and 200 had the same type rating. The pilots might still need some training to move between similar variants, something that we call differences training, but that's relatively quick. It only takes a few hours and often even without having to do a sim session. But by contrast, a full type rating could last a couple of months or more. So that's something a manufacturer like Boeing obviously tries to avoid. But when a new aircraft variant is introduced with completely new engines, bigger wings, better avionics and other large system improvements, eventually these changes could stack up high enough for the authorities to require a new type rating. And that is exactly what happened with Boeing 737 Classic family, the 737-300, 400 and 500. Pilots flying an airline's existing 737-200s just couldn't easily transition to these newest jets, and for the airlines using those older variants, that was quite a big deal. Getting this new type rating would mean taking these pilots off the roster and have them go through flight training for many weeks before they could be checked out. Today, pilots generally only operate one aircraft type at a time, meaning that with a few specific exceptions, pilots can't just jump between types that have different ratings. But those rules weren't quite as strict back in the 1980s when the Classic was introduced. But even so, a need for a separate type rating was a big concern for the airlines, since adding just a couple of dozen aircraft with a new rating would mean that hundreds of pilots would now need weeks of training and simulator time instead of making money flying passengers. So, did Boeing do something wrong here? Could they perhaps have avoided the needs for a new type rating for the 737 Classic? And what does any of this have to do with this video of me playing around in a Boeing 757? Well, I'll get to that in a moment, but when we're on the subject of playing around, I think there is a lot of that going on with our personal data at the moment. Now, as a content creator, a lot of my information is technically already public, like my business registration, domain ownership and things like that. And while that's okay, I can actually control how much of my other data I'm leaking online. To do that, I'm using today's sponsor, NordVPN, which is the fastest VPN on the planet and the only one certified by independent cybersecurity experts. My favorite feature is the Threat Protection Pro, who scans all the websites I'm visiting while researching videos like this and blocks everything that contains something sketchy. In June of 2025, Threat Protection Pro stopped over 50 million phishing attempts as an example. But data leaks doesn't have to involve sensitive information to be an issue. As I'm sure you know, websites can leave cookies in your browser, which are little trackers that signal which websites you visit, how long you stay and what you're looking at. And that's then used to build profiles of you, influencing your search results, ads and articles that you see. Now, NordVPN blocks this trail of cookies completely, which has helped me feel much safer and less annoyed when I'm browsing. So to start using Nord yourselves, head over to nordvpn.com/mentor now or scan this QR code to get 4 extra months for free when you sign up for their 2-year plan. And remember, Nord always offers you a 30-day money-back guarantee, so it's completely risk-free. Thank you, Nord. Now let's continue. So, what could Boeing have done differently about the 737 Classic when they had the chance then? Well, avoiding a new type rating would not have been possible. Boeing knew full well what a hassle this would be, but also that it was necessary because of the many upgrades that were needed. But there was another key factor at play here. Remember what I said earlier about Boeing developing the 757 and the 767 in the late 1970s? Well, those new designs obviously needed a new type rating as well, but crucially, the 757 and the 767 shared a common type rating between them. This meant that despite the fact that the 757 is a single-aisle aircraft and the 767 is a wide-body, pilots trained on one could fly both of them with only a quick difference training, and they could then switch back and forth between them at will. So a pilot could be rostered to fly a Boeing 757 on a Monday, then a 767 on Tuesday, and then back again to the 757 later in the week, which the airline bosses and crew scheduling absolutely loved, of course. Now, Boeing could make this happen because since they were developing the two jets at the same time, they could make sure that they shared the same cockpit and that systems, procedures and handling between them was as similar as possible. Which brings up a key question. Since Boeing had to give the 737 Classic a new, separate type rating from the older 737s, why didn't they modify the new 737s a bit more to give them the same type rating as the 757 and the 767? In terms of the timeline, Boeing announced the launch and the first orders for the 737-300 early in 1981, which was just months before the first 767 flew, a time when the specifications and systems and avionics for these jets would have been more or less frozen. The first 737-300 would then fly nearly 3 years after the 767, making it a natural follow-up project to the other two jets if Boeing had wanted to treat it that way. A common type rating with its newer, bigger siblings should have made this hypothetical 737/757 hybrid even more attractive to airlines, and the commonality would motivate even more airlines to tie themselves to a Boeing fleet, helping Boeing secure more future orders. So, did Boeing just ignore that after having gone through all of the trouble of giving the 757 and the 767 the same type rating? Well, we're now going to speculate quite a bit, which is always fun, but the idea we're putting forward here isn't as outrageous as you might think. You see, the 737 and the 757 share the same fuselage width, although the fuselage of the 757 is a bit taller, giving the plane more space for baggage and cargo. But the two planes are close enough that in theory you could modify a 737 fuselage to give it the entire nose and cockpit section of a 757. And by the way, we 737 pilots would have really loved that. The 757's cockpit is much roomier than that of the 737 because the 737's nose kind of tapers back more gradually towards the rear as you look at it from above. Now, the reason for that has to do with the way that the 737 evolved from the 727 and the 707, whilst newer jets like the 757 and even the Airbus A320 generally have a more blunt profile and therefore a bigger flight deck. But you don't need to take my word for how nice the 757's cockpit is. Just check out how it looked when I got my hands on a 757 sim in Iceland a few years ago. And no, I'm not joining an airline who flies the 757, even though that would have been quite awesome. No, instead, I was invited to hold a keynote speech about the state of aviation in Iceland, and as part of that, one of my friends there invited me to try out this gem. Now, as a Boeing 737NG and MAX pilot, I can tell you that the 757 was really impressive. The avionics were obviously older and the automatics were not as refined as they are in the latest 737 generations, but man, it had some performance, and the handling was more direct and responsive, like a sports car almost. I actually found it much easier to hand fly than the 737-800, and I did a visual circuit and landing at max crosswind, as well as a takeoff with engine failure without any real issues at all. It is just a really lovely machine. And on a separate note, it also didn't feel radically different to the 737, so the points that I'm making in this video is kind of based on that. Now, I'll come back to those observations a little bit later, but the point here is that if Boeing would have updated the 737 to give it the nose and cockpit of the 757, along with many of the systems that they had already developed for the 7.5 and 7.6, well, then a common type rating between them all should have maybe been possible. Now, some of you are probably asking here, hang on, why go through all of the trouble of modifying a 737 with a 757 cockpit? Why not just forget about the 737 Classic and all newer 737s for that matter, and just make a smaller 757 instead? Well, Boeing actually considered doing that, sort of. When they announced the base model of the 757, the 757-200, they also launched a shorter variant, which would have been called the 757-100. But there were a couple of problems with that. Firstly, it wasn't really small enough. The standard 757-200 has more or less the same size as an Airbus A321, and the smaller 757-100 would have been roughly equivalent to an Airbus A320 or a later 737-800. So it would have been bigger than the biggest of the three 737 Classics at the time, which was the 737-400. Secondly, and this might upset some 757 fans out there, the 757 is just a very heavy aircraft. The reason the plane flies like a muscle car, like I mentioned, is because it was built to have excess thrust out of its massive engine so that it could operate from relatively short runways or hot and high conditions, all while carrying a full load of passengers. But that also meant that the plane was overbuilt. Those powerful engines are quite heavy, and so is a lot of its structure, including its nice tall landing gear and boogie main gear wheel setup. That robustness was acceptable in the 757-200 when the excess weight was spread out over 200 plus passengers, but the same wasn't true when the passenger count went down to 170 or even less. Now, Boeing did still propose this jet to the airlines, but there were no takers, so they just cancelled it pretty early on. Now, if Boeing had instead adapted the cockpit and systems of the 757 to a 737 fuselage using the CFM56 engines, things could have been quite different. Not only would that plane have a commonality with its bigger siblings, it would also have a feature that is still missing from the 737 today, an engine indicating and crew alerting system, or ACAS. This is a feature that the 737 family really misses. It just makes it so much easier to troubleshoot any issues and therefore hopefully avoid fatal mistakes like shutting down the wrong engine, for example. And to be clear here, the 737 has a system to alert its pilots that something isn't right, and it's called the Master Caution System. In the cockpit, this consists of Master Caution and Annunciator lights, which are supposed to direct our attention towards whatever the problem is. But this system doesn't present information in the kind of centralized way that a newer ACAS system would, which is why regulators now require newly certified aircraft to include these kind of systems. The Master Caution System really is a relic from the 60s. So the 757 and the 767 does have ACAS system on their screens, and actually Boeing fitted those same screens in the 737 Classic as well, but without adding ACAS. So then, why? Why did Boeing give the 737 Classic a separate type rating from everything else? Well, a quick answer is that even though the plane's longer-term connection with the 757 and 767 would have been promising, the first orders for the 737 Classic mostly came from airlines that had 737 Jurassics, companies like US Airways and Southwest Airlines, who wanted to minimize the differences. But more fundamentally, the issue here is that Boeing was not really thinking longer term with this, or at least they didn't believe that the 737 would be part of their longer term single-aisle aircraft lineup. As I kind of alluded to in the beginning, Boeing basically treated this 737 update as just that, an update. This was a quick fix approach to make the 737 competitive with anything that the other makers were coming up with in the few years that were immediately following. But after that, Boeing wanted to create something entirely new, or at least that was the plan. As we have covered in several other videos, Boeing was exploring quite a few other projects in the 1980s, and they fully expected to have to provide an all-new middle-of-the-market aircraft below the 757 in size before the end of that decade. Sure enough, Boeing actually went ahead with detailed studies of something known as the 7J7, a plane with rear-mounted open-fan engines, which we have looked at in other videos on this channel as well. But that technology simply wasn't ready for that, and it was soon cancelled, paving the way for the 737NG instead. And unfortunately, a lot of the details in the development of the 737 Classic would then become a reoccurring theme in the 737 saga. In the 1990s, the 737NG was seen as another quick update with newer CFM56 engines, and just like the 737 Classic had borrowed some avionics from the 75 and the 767, the 737NG cockpit screens came from the 777, and later the 737 MAX would get some even newer cockpit toys from the 787. In fact, if we go back to the development of the original 737 in the 1960s, even that aircraft was supposed to be a bit of a quick fix or a stopgap. After developing the 727, Boeing thought that they could turn their attention to bigger airliners like the jumbo jet, which would become the 747, as well as their supersonic transport, or SST, which would get the designation 2707. But this changed when they realized that they would need to respond to the launch of the Douglas DC-9, which was smaller than their 727 at that time. So they just borrowed as much as they could from the 727 and the 707 in order to come up with a good competitor, which to their credit they really did. And that is actually the great irony of the Boeing 737. It is the best-selling aircraft that Boeing has ever made, and realistically the best that they will ever make, since it's unlikely that any other aircraft will remain in production for as long as it did. And yet, in terms of development, the 737 was always treated as the bridesmaid. It was always either the project that had to be gotten out of the way of something bigger and better, or just something that wasn't that important to spend too much time on. And that trend started way before Boeing and McDonnell Douglas merged in the late 1990s. Then, in the 2000s, Boeing stopped the production of the 757, and once again, many of their critics asked, what if they had retired the Boeing 737 instead? But frankly, I think that was an unfair question. As we've covered before on this channel, in the aftermath of 9/11, the reality was that they had plenty of 737NG orders, but almost none for the 757. Boeing had actually intended to stop producing both the 737 and the 757 and replace them with something entirely new after they were done developing the 787. But the dry spell of the post-9/11 market forced them to pick one of them in order to retire early. So they killed the type that had no more orders, which kind of makes sense. But a more interesting question is, how different would things have looked if the 737 had been modernized more effectively back in the 1980s? Between then and the 2000s, the 757 and the 767 had been upgraded slowly with newer avionics, which our hypothetical hybrid 737/757 would have also benefited from. So, how do you think that would have affected the 737's later development with CFM LEAP engines? And we can't know the answer to that, but to pilots like me and Ben, who have been flying the 737 for so many years, the really sad thing about this jet is that after staying in the skies for so long, it will probably end up being remembered for all of the wrong reasons. So what do you think? Was Boeing justified to do what they did with the 737 back then, knowing what they knew? Let us know what you think below in the comments. Or have you got another what-if scenario that you think it might be worth exploring? My patrons have been able to discuss this for a while now in the Patreon app, and if you want to get access to my videos early as well, then click on this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. Everything really helps. Also, check out our new merch store below and let us know what you think of our new designs and posters. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.